performance working, please?
It is.
Thank you. Okay, bye, Arda. So we're continuing our discussion on decolonization and the legacies of colonialism. And we had an opportunity to look at India in last week's lecture. Welcome to HMR 1. And we looked at two critical concepts in the decolonization process that not only help us understand how decolonization works, how decolonization was achieved, but also where some of the lingering effects come from. So one of the first issues we looked at was the concept of satyagraha, or non-violence, which was developed by Mahatma Gandhi, who was one of the leaders of the Indian independence movement, one of the most charismatic of them, who also, borrowed some of these ideas from Henry David Thoreau, but unlike Thoreau, actually had to lead a nation to independence. And then we also then saw how the nonviolent idea, this idea of nonviolence in opposition to a much more powerful, not in terms of moral authority, but a much more powerful opponent in terms of access to weapons and violence, empowers those who ultimately demonstrate their strength by being nonviolent. And I hope you had a chance to, and if you have, we've uploaded into Slack, and I've asked the TAs to share with you the American Experience selection on the Freedom Riders and their experience with nonviolence. And one of the things that I thought was very interesting about that was how some of the young men who talked about being nonviolent said they didn't believe in nonviolence, but they understood it as a critical tool. So Gandhi wanted it to be an ideology. He wanted it to be a way of life. And I think this came from both his understanding of sort of emerging needs of establishing a modern multicultural nation like India, but also I think to try to resonate with older Buddhist and Jain traditions in India. So that was one part. The other part was partition. Now partition is what led to the creation of, in the late 1940s, two countries, Pakistan and India, and then by the 1970s, three countries, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. In any case, the public reasons for partition were not the same as the underlying logic of partition. Partition, the one way to think about it, is that it's the gift that keeps on giving. In other words, it was a way to create inherent instability between India and Pakistan, as well as build on pre-existing differences within Indian and then Pakistani society. So these are two critical elements that help us understand help us understand colonialism as a critical human wrong. But these are also two conceptual items that have carried forward into other conflicts. And in fact, satyagraha, or nonviolence, is one of the most critical tools human rights activists and human rights defenders will often use to protect and promote human rights of others. And of course, partition is one of those items of our contemporary world that continues to, I think, create conditions under which human rights violations perpetuate themselves. And here I'm thinking primarily of Israel-Palestine, but there are more other examples from our recent past, including in Ireland. And one wonders if partition is a political solution in other parts of the world as well. So I want to now move to a different question, which is the role of violence, extreme violence, in the achievement of decolonization. And to do so, we'll be using the example of the Algerian War for Independence, which goes roughly from, politically it begins in 1950 and ends in 1961, about a decade of struggle. And I've always said this, and I'm not alone in saying this, Decolonization is always a violent process. Violence is always involved. As much as when we talk about India, as much as we'd like that experience, for example, to be a hallmark of the use of nonviolence to achieve decolonization, the process was extraordinarily violent, culminating in the terrible violence that occurred with the exchange of populations following the partition of the countries. So, in the case of Algeria, violence really was foregrounded in the relationship between those struggling for the independence of Algeria and the French colonial sort of masters of Algeria. So, Algeria is where we really begin to understand also the incredible implications for human rights of the anti-colonial struggle. And many of our theories of colonization, decolonization, and human rights thought around racism and colonialism also emerge. So just basic background on the French in Algeria. The French had been in Algeria, had invaded and occupied the northern coast of what is today Algeria. And if you just in your mind put together a map, and in that map imagine the south of France and the main city of Marseille, then go due south and you run into the city of Wahran or Oran in North Africa. And then if you go a little bit to the east, you get to Algiers. It had been a major province of the Ottoman Empire, very wealthy. In 1830, under sort of a French monarch who imagined himself sort of the descendant of Napoleon, it was conquered. And it wasn't conquered like a colony to be exploited from afar. It was conquered as a colony or an extension of France itself. And really from 1930 until 1960, many in France imagined that Algeria was just a part of France. Now this imagination of contiguity between Algeria and France was not necessarily shared by many Algerians. So Algeria was invaded, occupied, and over many generations, the French and Italians and Spanish Europeans slowly moved into Algeria and created colonial settlements. They would occupy the main cities of Algeria itself and would build sort of the European city, which was newer and modern and away from the city that had existed during the Ottoman period, which is where Algerians were forced to live. And this created a society in which part of it was European and then part of it was Algerian. So into this context comes a very original and important thinker in the history of colonialism, of human rights, of decolonization, of race and racism, and even psychiatry. And that's Frantz Fanon. And you have in your files an excerpt from discussions of colonialism and violence from his most important work, The Wretched of the Earth, which may be the one book that he wrote that some of you could have had some exposure to in other courses. And certainly you'll hear about this work at some point, other points during your undergraduate career. So Frantz Fanon was born in Martinique, which is part of the French West Indies, and he was descended of enslaved humans from West Africa who were brought to Martinique to cultivate sugarcane. Martinique was one of France's primary sugarcane production sites, like Jamaica had been for the British. So he was born in 1925, and he learned French as a child, and all young people in Martinique, especially like he who showed some brilliance early on, learned French, and then when he was 18 years old, he joined the Free French Army. This is during the Second World War, and he joined the army of the people of the government that had occupied his country, voluntarily, and he fought against fascists in North Africa and Italy. And it was during that time in Europe that his thinking about racism began to form. When he lived in Martinique, he was surrounded almost exclusively by other people who looked a lot like him, and he really sort of enjoyed a certain amount of prestige because his father was a local bureaucrat. But when he was in Europe, he began to understand that European whites in Italy and elsewhere, didn't view him as a liberator, as someone who was French, but rather viewed him as someone who was black, first and foremost. And he tells the story of how liberated Italian women would prefer to dance with German prisoners than with black Africans, West Indians like he, who had been part of the Liberation Army. So this began to create his sort of consciousness of race and race difference during the context of the Second World War. It also sort of brought to mind, we're fighting, the World War II was a war that was apparently fought for human liberation and ultimately was the backdrop for the creation of the modern human rights idea. As sort of what's going on here? So he was able to do his undergraduate, earn his bachelor's degree, and then specialize in psychiatry at a French university in Lyon. And I think it's very important to note that the French language and being able to be part of this French colonial world through that language was very important for Fanon as his career continued. So he finished up his degree, and he took a job not back in the West Indies, but as a chief of a hospital in Algeria. And it's there he began to think about the impact of colonialism on the mental health and the worldview of colonized peoples. And this led to his first important book, which derives from his doctoral dissertation. And that book is called Black Skin, White Mass. In other words, he believed one of his central argument, with many arguments in it, but I don't have as much time to talk about this as I would like, but his central argument was that colonized peoples, in this particular case, blacks in the West Indies, internalized the way white people viewed and treated them. In other words, it became a reality that they were inferior, that they were not quite European, even if they attempted to do everything possible to be white, to perfect their French, to go to school, to serve in the army. That was just a mask. And under the mask was the reality, which was that Europeans would always view them as black no matter how much they achieved, and that blacks themselves had, and this was his concern about mental health, blacks themselves had internalized the way that whites perceived them and believed it to be normal. Okay, so he goes to Algeria and he becomes he's drawn into the Algerian anti-colonial struggle, and I'll talk more about that in a second. And it's from his experience in that struggle that he begins to come up with some of the critical terms and arguments that we use today about why colonialism is a human wrong and understanding the force of decolonization. Now, I don't agree with all of Fanon's thought, but I find a lot of it compelling, and it's okay not to agree with someone, but you can still appreciate their ideas. And I think that, on the other hand, Fanon was saying things about the impact of colonialism on colonized people at the time that no one else was saying. So he begins to develop a series of ideas about the impact of colonialism and anti-colonialism. And I want to focus on three of those ideas. And these occur both in some of his writing about Algeria in newspapers, and then become woven into his most important book that was published just before he died of leukemia in 1961. Still very, very young. He died in 1961 in a major work called The Wretched of the Earth, which you have a selection from in your, as I said before, in your files. So, the three ideas. The first, Fanon makes his argument that the idea of the human is an idea that comes from the European tradition and is fundamentally a racial idea. In other words, the way Europeans defined the human was fundamentally a racial idea, and it was deployed as a tool in colonization. And the critical idea here is that the colonized are not quite human. We've heard this before, and I think you've seen this in action when we were thinking about King Leopold and the Belgian Congo. That for colonialism to work, there had to be this degree of dehumanization. And so Fanon really addresses this head on and says that what we have to do is displace the racialized idea of the human and move to what he called a new humanism, one that really understood equality but was not defined by the oppression of others. In other words, in some extent, we've been seeing how the human is defined in the spaces created by oppression. And he was saying, no, we have to find a different way to think about what makes us human. And I would argue, of course, that the human rights idea forms the most effective modern basis for the definition of the human. His second idea is that colonialism is built around the idea that the only complete human is the whites. The only complete human is a white European, probably male. Right? He didn't work a lot on gender in those days. So colonialism is built around not just the idea of dehumanizing the colonized, but that the real human being is white and European. So it's not, and this is a globalized idea, which then leads to some of his arguments about how anti-colonialism must be a global idea. And then his third idea is this notion of post-colonialism. What are we supposed to do when we achieve liberation? And this is especially about, this brings up for him discussions about other kinds of practices and ideas that were present or are continuing to be present in colonial society that are themselves oppressive. Like they have an oppressive nature, not similar, but they're oppressive alongside the oppression of colonialism. And he sees these, for example, in certain kinds of what he called traditional Muslim practices, including a hyper-patriarchal family structure, the oppression of women, and then he talked about, in particular, the forced veiling or unveiling, the forced veiling of women by the Algerian religious establishment, and the forced unveiling of Algerian women by the French colonial government. Neither of those entities, and this is an important thing to note, were asking Algerian women what they wanted to do. So that's sort of one of the key ideas about Fanon's thinking about tradition, language, and in this case Islam, in the post-colonial period. And he said that rather than sort of looking at post-colonialism as a return to the period before colonialism was established, arguing that was absolutely impossible, that too much time had passed, too much water had gone under that bridge, and too many important, what he would see as positive, progressive advancements in thought, infrastructure, science, medicine, education, and politics, especially Marxist politics, had occurred to go back. His argument was, look, we don't have to think about this now, but the critical thing is Algerians, rather than colonialism or the international community, have the right and responsibility to make those decisions in a context where they can do so freely. Okay. So those are some of the basic ideas, and then they form the basis of his later work, The Wretched of the Earth. And the most important idea to take from The Wretched of the Earth, which again appeared in 1961 and comes from a line from the French version of the socialist anthem, the International, Le Dame de la Terre, is a broad theoretical analysis of the impact of settler colonialism on colonized society. And he makes the idea, and this is the critical point I want you to take from The Wretched of the Earth for this content, for this part of the lecture, is that settler colonialism is built on the systematic dehumanization of the colonized, but also the creation of an immutable and absolute binary. Now, binary, right? Those of you who are in computer science, binary, it's either 1 or 0. In this case, colonialism creates a situation where there's either the colonized, the settler, right, or the native. The settler or the native. There's nothing in between. There's no way to negotiate. And in fact, there's no way for the settler and the native to somehow come together and create a new kind of society. And so settler colonialism cannot admit any kind of blending or ambiguity in the relationship between the settler and the colonized. You're one or the other, right? And so he argues then that the absolute nature of the binary makes violence inevitable. And there's a certain logic to that. He just lived through the Algerian Civil War, which we'll talk about here in a second, and it was extremely violent. Now, I think we can argue that doesn't necessarily have to be true, and I hope that some of you will be able to study more about South Africa and the end of apartheid. We do talk at length about it again in Human Rights 134, but it may be the exception that proves the rule. My own personal experience from working on settler colonialism states and thinking about colonialism is that it's very difficult to avoid the kind of outcome that Fanon has discussed. But regardless, I'm about to move on to the next part of the lecture, but Fanon helped define for modern human rights studies, for anti-colonial studies, and really the study of colonialism and decolonization. He helped create our historical and contemporary vocabulary. Many of the things that Fanon observed and wrote about sit at the center of the history and the way we approach thinking about the decolonization. And in fact, they're still present, right? I mean, the term settler colonialism comes from Fanon. It was in part because he explained it against the backdrop of Algeria, but we use it often when we think about the impact on Palestinian and Israeli society in the Israel-Palestine conflict. And it's an idea that's been taken up and is being used to help us understand conflicts between indigenous peoples and the settler colonial states of the Western Hemisphere, Australia and New Zealand. So let me now move to, however, the Algerian War. And I want to talk about the Algerian War not just in terms of violence and in legacies, but also to introduce another concept, which is the concept of torture. Torture is a form of violence, but it's often seen as its own unique category. And the Algerian Civil War is when torture reached its industrial level. There was an industrial scale, widespread scale, such an enormous amount of torture during the Algerian War that it's really one of the elements of it that we still associate with it. I mean, it was almost definitive of it. In the way, if you wait a second, in the way that the cutting of limbs has been so important in the way we think about the era of King Leopold in Congo and then in the post-colonial period. So, just background, many Algerians had fought in the Second World War, and many had been educated in France. And so at the end of the Second World War, they thought, just like Fanon, like, what did we fight this war for? Why are we being treated the way we are? Many of us are learning French. We're professionals, we're educated, yet we're excluded from running our own country. You also had a growing movement among French Islamists, people who really believed that Islam should be at the center of both politics and life, who were increasingly in opposition to sort of ideas not just about French colonialism, but ideas of others about creating sort of democratic, modernizing states. And while there was some effort to seek a peaceful transition, the French, when they looked at Algeria, and as I said this before, they didn't see a separate country, many of them. They just saw, far south France. It was part of France. It'd been so since before anyone living at that time had been born. So unlike the idea that, for example, the British, had only had, in Nigeria or in West Africa, there was very little settlement there. These were relatively recent. Losing Algeria was like losing a physical part of France itself, losing a limb even. So so there was very little room for compromise, and by 1954, the version in Algeria of the Indian National Congress, the FLN, or the National Liberation Front, Front Libération Nationale, opposed them and launched violent attacks on French military and government targets. There began to be massacres, and I'm not a big fan of both sidism, saying, oh, both sides are bad. But in this case, both sides did terrible things. And that's because it wasn't as though there were not civilian targets in Algeria. There was over 1 million Algerians, 1 million people of French and European origin living in Algeria at the time. So this all culminates in 1956, 1957 with the Battle of Algiers. The Front National had moved from the countryside and fighting battles, often in sort of military engagements, to urban warfare, urban guerrilla warfare. It's one of the first times this had happened, and it was extremely brutal. And the French local authorities lost containment, and so the French began the first sort of, in terms of the history of warfare, the counter-insurgency effort, and brought the French military in from France, but also French colonial troops from Southeast Asia, from Africa, and the French Foreign Legion. And as part of the insurgents, torture was a central element of that insurgency, not primarily to produce information, but to terrorize the population into submission. So, in Algeria, this torture included the use of rape, male rape in particular, electrocution, where electrodes are attached primarily to one's genitalia, and then to a car battery, and it's extremely painful, but it doesn't kill you, and waterboarding, which is where a form of simulated drowning. And there was so much torture that it is estimated that in this period about 40% of Algeria's adult male population was tortured. And this is where you get the sense it's not about information, it's not about, torture is never about information, but it's about control. What the French were doing to Algeria's male population was saying, if you step out of line, this is what's going to happen to you. And also they used a kind of dirty war style disappearance of their population, something that to some extent prefigures the use of systematic disappearance of civilians during dirty wars in Argentina, Chile, and other parts of South America. In fact, the French were very effective in suppressing the urban insurgency in Algeria, so much so that they changed some of their tactics and became much more interested in trying to internationalize the conflict. So, But within just a few years, well, let me just talk briefly about torture. So torture is one of the, to some extent, when people think about human rights abuse, torture is one of the things that we think about. And that is because torture is not just in the immediate nature of torture, in the immediate act of torture or rights abuse, but in the context, the social, political, and in some cases military context in which torture takes place, usually signals a much broader human rights problem. So what the French did in Algeria was torture. It was not illegal at that point under international law because the Geneva Conventions, which banned torture during conflict, at that point did not apply to suppressing rebels in a colonial holding. It was against the law, against French law, but because the Algerians were not seen as citizens of France, it didn't apply to them. You can kind of get hints of this in what the United States did to combatants taken from the battlefield in Iraq and Afghanistan in the 2000s. So, in the 60s, there was no international law banning torture, but by 1984, because of the historical experience of what was going on in South America, but also it happened in France, the international community did gather and created what's called the Convention Against Torture, which was signed in 1984. And one of the interesting elements about the CAT is it is absolutely categorical about the fact that torture cannot be used. And cannot be used, for example, in the sort of the something you see on television a lot, which is the ticking time bomb scenario, where somehow a terrorist knows about a bomb somewhere. In order to get access to it before it goes off, you have to torture them. Article 2, subsection 2 reads of the CAT, no exceptional circumstances whatsoever, whether a state of war or a threat of war, internal political stability, or any other public emergency may be invoked as a justification for torture. Now, one thing I would like to do perhaps in the question period, but I would encourage the TAs to think about, is to ask you during section to imagine how torture can sometimes have the opposite effect to what a government like France wants it to do. In other words, did it really discipline the Algerian population into submission, or could it have had the opposite effect? So, regardless, the Algerian War expanded, the Front National, the FLN expanded what it considered to be its zones of warfare, not just to Algeria, but took the war to France. This led to the fall of the French government. They had to create a new government, a new constitution. There was fear of civil war in France. There was an attempted assassination of the president of France. There was the mass roundup and secret murder of Algerians living in France, including many Algerian college students your age. And so this was just untenable, and in 1962, negotiations between the French and the National Front took place, and the French essentially surrendered and said, we're out of there, we're gone. And as a consequence, about 1.1 million Europeans and North African Jews left Algeria permanently and moved to France or other parts of the world. I have an aunt, in fact, who left then and moved to Virginia with her American husband. You also have large numbers of Algerians who fought against the National Liberation Front on behalf of France. They are called the Harkis, spelled Harki, who had to resettle in France as well. And these Pieds Noirs, as they were called, which means that was the term used to describe the European settlers. It means foot of black, meaning that they might have been white, but because they had stepped onto the African continent, their foot had become black. Right? So, and Algeria really struggled terribly after that period because France removed much of the infrastructure, the intellectual talent, the agricultural support that could have been used to make the country successful. But Algeria did have oil, which was one of its, one of the few things that it could draw upon to support its population. Now, I want to focus briefly on one of the legacies of the Algerian Civil War, and that is the Algerian Civil War, which occurred between 1991 and 2002. Again, about a decade-long struggle. And this was an outcome of the unstable coalition which had fought against the French from 1950 to 1961. So it sort of percolated for 3 decades and then came out as there was a larger politicization of Islam and the growth of more violent Islamist movements in North Africa and the Middle East. So in 1991, the armed Islamic group and others associated with them, well, let me just step back for a second. Algeria had an election in which a more radical Islamist political party successfully beat the FLN party. It was a poorly contested election, and the National Liberation Front said, we cannot accept the victory of this group because it will lead to the destruction of Algeria as a democracy. And so they mounted a civilian coup d'etat, which pushed the Islamists into violent opposition. And the war that followed was typified by Algerian War for Independence style and magnitudes of violence and torture and brutality, where somewhere near 100,000 people died. And I remember, if you remember, I talked some about this idea of colonial knowledge in the post-colony. Observers would often make the claim that the style of warfare employed by both sides in the Algerian Civil War seemed to have been something they learned from the experience with decolonization. So Algeria has actually become a relatively stable state since then. So I'm going to conclude now with two ideas, and then one idea and then a suggestion. And this brings us back to Fanon. One of the most important things that Fanon did was begin to imagine colonialism as a global phenomenon. Now, we've always looked at it in this course as a global phenomenon, but you could imagine a time when it wasn't perceived as such, but rather the French in India, the British in India, the French in Algeria, and not even talking about colonialism, but rather this was a normal behavior of modern European states to have overseas holdings. What Fanon did is he said, no, this is a phenomenon. This is a phenomenon that has similar impacts on people around the world. It didn't matter if they were in India or in the Caribbean or in Africa, right? The impacts on the people living there were very similar, and that demanded a similar kind of global response. And so there's it's no coincidence that the 1960 Declaration on Decolonization really accompanies this beginning global understanding of colonialism as this, like slavery, something that had to be eliminated. So we'll look more at that in a subsequent lecture, the 1960 Declaration. But what I also want to do is encourage you to watch a film over we have the Wednesday off to commemorate Veterans Day. And I encourage you to watch a film, 1966 film by Gilles Pontevedra. It's in black and white, doesn't mean it's bad, called The Battle of Algiers. It's an extraordinary film and considered one of the classics of decolonization cinema. It's available on both YouTube and Amazon Prime, and I've included a wonderful essay on the film from Film Quarterly. So those who are interested in the intersection of art and cinema and human rights, I encourage you to take a look at that film. Thank you.